the private meeting between Elvis and the Beatles that forever changed their legacies.
But before we start, please take a moment to give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll never miss these great stories.
It's hard to believe that two of the biggest musical influences in history, Elvis Presley and the Beatles, only ever met once. Late on August 27, 1965, the Fab Four visited the King of Rock in his home at 525 Perugia Way in Bel Air, California. The mysterious background of the invitation and what really happened during their meeting weren't exposed until years later. Insiders are confessing that the strange encounter impacted both parties for the rest of their lives. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. The Beatles were on the US leg of an international tour when they finally had a chance to meet Elvis. Everything was quite secretive, Priscilla Presley admitted later on. Not a big deal was made about it because no one wanted it to get out to the press. Reporters would have lost their minds trying to get pictures if the event was announced. When I put the idea of meeting Elvis to John, Paul, George, and Ringo, they were initially put off by the fact that the press might be involved, said Tony Barrow, the Beatles' press officer who accompanied the band on their visit. But the offer was too tempting to ignore. I remember George saying, "If this is going to be another dirty big publicity circus, let's forget it." They did want to meet their rock and roll idol, but not with a gang of reporters and photographers around to hassle them, Tony explained. Both Elvis and the Beatles were wildly popular, though their careers were perhaps headed in different directions. Though his earlier music and films were still liked, Elvis was going through a slump. His 60s output saw him fighting to remain relevant, as he was so busy making cheesy movies that he barely had time to focus on his music. Presley had been the biggest star in the world, but he was quickly being eclipsed by the four lads from Liverpool. Beatlemania had been in full swing for about a year, and they'd released Help, only a few weeks before driving to Elvis' home. On the way there, John, Paul, George, and Ringo felt nervous about the meeting. They all had worshipped the king, but had very little idea of what he would be like in person. Elvis was important for everyone who came after him, said Anthony DeCurtis of Rolling Stone. He was a hugely disruptive force and inspiring for that reason alone. Lennon was attracted to that rebellious quality, in particular, but Paul, too, was a great admirer of Elvis. As accustomed as they were to meeting other musicians, Elvis intimidated the Fab Four. The famous Elvis fans followed his manager, Colonel Parker, to Elvis' home in a limousine. The Beatles were then waved through the mansion's high gates and parked in front of the enormous house. Once inside the front door, our feet seemed to sink inches into deep white shag pile carpeting, Tony said. We arrived in the center of the building, into this massive circular room bathed in red and blue light, and this was where the king entertained, Tony said. This was Elvis Presley's giant playpen, complete with a color television, a jukebox, a deep crescent-shaped couch, a couple of pool and games tables and a well-stocked bar. Then there was the man himself. Elvis was seated on one of the room's couches in front of a muted TV. No one was sure what to say at first. It was a little bit awkward because they kept looking at him and not really saying anything, Priscilla recalled. According to Tony, it was John who spoke first. Lennon was awkwardly blurting out a stream of questions at Elvis, and not necessarily polite ones. Why do you do all these soft-centered ballads for the cinema these days? What happened to good old rock and roll? Elvis laughed at the fast-talking John, but seemed offended by his interrogative nature. Elvis suddenly plugged the gap by calling for some guitars to be handed out to John, Paul and George, and a piano was hauled into view, Tony said. Up to that point, the party really had been a bit lifeless and unexciting. But as soon as Presley and the Beatles began to play together, the atmosphere livened up. The boys found that they could make much better conversation with their guitars than they could with their spoken word. Music was their natural meeting point, their most intelligent means of communication, Tony said. The Beatles and Elvis had different backgrounds, but were connected musically. I can't remember all the things that they played, but I do remember one of the songs was, "I Feel Fine," Tony said. And I remember Ringo, who of course didn't have an instrument, tapping out the backbeat with his fingers on the nearest bits of wooden furniture. Everybody was singing. Soon, the musicians lost track of time. They played for about 4 hours, until Colonel Parker ended the party. He gave them Elvis Presley records as gifts and sent the musicians on their way. From there, the meeting had an awkward ending. Lennon, in a poor attempt at humor, did an Adolf Hitler impression in Elvis' driveway. And after they parted ways, both sides shared some surprising impressions. As they drove away, John insisted, Elvis was stoned. And George asked, aren't we all? The worst of the King's pill addiction wouldn't come until several years later, but it was quite possible that Presley was under the influence of something. They tried to make light of it and not show too much adoration for their idol, but Elvis Presley was their idol and one of the prime influences of the Beatles' music, Tony said. And that encounter took on a special meaning years later. He is our idol. I just remember sitting there and him playing the bass, John said in a 1975 interview. And me thinking, it's Elvis. It's Elvis. It's actually Elvis. He looked great then, no weight on him. He looked good. John wasn't the only Beatle to fawn over their jam sessions. It was one of the great meetings of my life, Paul said. I think he liked us. I think at that time, he may have felt a little bit threatened, but he didn't say anything. We certainly didn't feel any antagonism. After they played with Elvis, the Fab Four invited him to visit them while they were in Los Angeles. But it would never happen. They didn't know it at the time, but there was a hint of bad blood. When the Beatles left, Blacker remembered that Elvis said, "I'm not going up there. I did my duty. I met them, and that's it," Elvis biographer Alana Nash said. Another one of Elvis' friends, author Chris Hutchins, explained that Elvis came to loathe John for his differing political views. John had annoyed Presley by making his anti-war feelings known the moment he stepped into the massive lounge and spotted the table lamps, model wagons engraved with the message, "All the way with LBJ," Chris said. Lennon was a vocal critic of Lyndon B. Johnson for escalating the Vietnam War, while Elvis, as a former Army serviceman, was more defensive about his country's foreign affairs. Besides their political disagreements, Elvis may have also been threatened by the Four and their continued success. Elvis, who never really understood the 60s, felt threatened by the Beatles, since they were having huge hits at a time he wasn't, when he was making formulaic movies, Alana said. When the Beatles first went to the States, it was like they were going to the Holy Land, and Elvis was their greatest idol. But I don't think it worked the other way. If anyone had anything to fear from the Beatles, it was Elvis, Tony said. And while plenty of listeners still preferred Elvis, the Fab Four had a huge advantage over him in terms of long-term success. Presley had to ride the highs and lows of fame alone, but John, Paul, George, and Ringo always had each other. One factor that set the Beatles apart from almost every other band that came before them was that they had no clear leader. They all contributed creatively and sang lead vocals at times. Still, two of them served as the engine behind each hit, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Together, they formed the most lucrative songwriting partnership in history and became rock and roll heroes, but it wasn't always that way. Simply put, they started out as friends. Both grew up in the tough streets of Liverpool, an industrial city trying to piece itself back together after World War II. In 1957, the two boys met at a church picnic where John was performing. Equally impressed and jealous of the other, John and Paul became fast friends. Paul joined his group, the Quarrymen, soon followed by George Harrison, and these teenage rock fanatics played all over, mostly to unenthused audiences. As the years passed, however, a notable change occurred. They improved, now calling themselves the Beatles and recruiting a drummer named Ringo. The rockers became the talk of Liverpool. Of course, every record executive out there thought they were a flash in the pan. The suits couldn't have been more wrong. By 1964, the Beatles took the world by storm, reaching a level of popularity that caused fan riots everywhere they went. John and Paul couldn't believe the ride they were on together.